Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our opening session of our Student Mental Health Summit. Whether you're joining us from your school building, your home office, or from your couch, it doesn't change how important this topic is. And if anything, it's really become amplified due to our current social environment. So, for our first session, this is really designed to give our participants a better overview of the many forms and facets that mental illness takes on. One of the great things about our opening session today is all teams received our school assessment survey. The school assessment survey was sent out in a previous email. However, we do have this document located under the Documents tab on the right-hand side of this platform. What this survey allows you to do as a team is to really take in this information, specifically the data trends for the state of Michigan, and try to align that with what programs and concepts you have going on in your school building. Because our team model allows for administrators, educators, and students together, you get a lot of perspectives on your building culture, your building environment, and this survey will be scored in different ways. So you can take this survey. Throughout our presentation, we will have pauses from our keynote presenter where you can put in some notes, jot down some scores, and then later this morning, we'll have some dedicated team time for you to collaborate and really try to make the most of our future keynote speakers and our future breakout sessions where you can select your building needs based off your survey feedback. So with that said, we'll get right to the action. We are very fortunate and very lucky to have our first presentation from Mr. Kevin Fisher. Kevin Fisher is the director of the National Alliance for Mental Health Michigan, and he is bringing our presentation today on student data trends. Mr. Kevin Fisher.
Good morning and welcome everyone to this year's 2020 Mental Health Summit. I'm Kevin Fisher, Executive Director for NAMI Michigan, and I want to tell you a little bit about how I got involved in the mental health movement. So we're going to watch a short video.
A Metro Detroit father has turned his unimaginable pain into a passion for helping others. As Fox 2's Dina Sedefati shows us, his goal is to save lives by keeping the conversation about mental illness alive.
Like any proud dad, Kevin Fisher's walls are filled with pictures of his son.
If you notice, he's catching a touchdown just as he's crossing the goal line.
His son, Dominique, an All-American kid, bright, well-liked, a three-sport athlete.
Always lit up a room, big smile. Everybody says this about their child, but everybody loved him. Everybody loved being around him.
But when Dominique went off to college, Kevin says he watched his son's bright light grow dim.
Dominique's diagnosis came as a complete surprise to his mom and I. His mom and I had divorced about a year prior in 2006. Dominique was away at John Carroll University his sophomore year and playing football, and from what we knew, doing very well. We saw no signs of mental illness with him.
So the initial diagnosis was surprising, schizophrenia, and then an additional diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Kevin learned mental health issues tend to affect young people between the ages of 15 and 24. Schizophrenia and bipolar disorder often appearing in the late teens and early 20s, just as Dominique's did. At first, his treatment and medication were working.
But like most schizophrenics in particular, there came a point where he convinced himself that the medication wasn't working, he didn't need it, and he took himself off his medication.
And then on June 27, 2010, at just 23 years old, Dominique was lost to suicide.
Losing Dominique, I always say, should have killed me. It was more than I could imagine.
Through the unimaginable pain, Kevin found his passion. He runs a foundation in his son's name, hosting events like this one, raising funds and awareness. He's also the executive director for the Michigan chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.
I can only say I wish I knew of NAMI before, because it really does provide the support and guidance that I was looking for when I was trying to help Dominique. There's a lot of support there.
Kevin says this is his last job he will ever have, his last fight. His dream that everyone will embrace the issue of mental health care. He wants to keep the conversation going until mental illness is treated like any other illness.
1 in 4 adults, 1 in 10 children live with mental illness. That's a big number, and it's treatable. It's a winnable fight.
If you or someone you love is in crisis, please call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK. As Kevin says, it's a winnable fight. You can support the work of NAMI throughout the year. They have a big mental health conference in Livonia every May and a walk on Belle Isle in September. Now let's head over to Jay.
Thank you so much, Sherry. We are inside the Ernie Harwell Sports Collection, and we're back with Mark Bowden. And this room is a really exciting room, especially if you're a fan of Ernie Harwell and you're a fan of Detroit Tigers baseball.
Yes, this was Ernie's personal library collection that he started donating to the library in 1966.
Boy, and there's a lot of great finds in here, especially for a Tigers fan, for an Ernie fan. Let's talk a little bit about the note cards that Ernie kept.
Yes, one of the things Ernie did to prepare for ball games was use his library, take notes on just about every baseball scenario, and what he would do is when he used a story in a game, he would date the card so he knew the last time that he used that story.
There's also a great scorecard, and you have several scorecards, right?
We have a number of scorecards. The one that's on display here is between the New York Yankees and Boston Red Sox from 1996, I believe. Cecil Fielder is actually listed on the lineup for the Yankees.
There is the original microphone from the booth and the monitors there that Ernie would have used, and there's also an autographed glove.
That's correct. One of that glove is signed by Ichiro Suzuki. Ichiro was one of Ernie's favorite ball players, and so he sent a glove and a book to him.
So anyone can come in here and take a look, right, during normal library hours?
For the room, typically they need to call us in advance so we have someone, make sure I have someone available to open up the room to them. But for researchers who want to look at photographs, books, or anything, come to the library anytime and we can pull that material for you.
Mark, it's great stuff and a great tour today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.
So, NAMI began in 1979 by a group of mothers who gathered at a kitchen table in Minnesota because they didn't feel that they had access to mental health resources for their children. So this group from Michigan and Minnesota got together and formed what we now know to be NAMI, the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization. We still affectionately refer to this group of mothers as the NAMI Mommies. NAMI excels in 4 areas. We listen. We operate a 24/7, 365 hotline where we take hundreds of thousands of calls each year to direct people to mental health resources and to also give them information on NAMI's education and support programs, which we offer at no cost in local communities. We educate through our education and support programs. We advocate. I spend a lot of time here in Lansing working with legislators on improving and increasing access to mental health services. And we lead by participating in public events like this, the NAMI Walks event, annual state conference, and many others. So who is NAMI? NAMI, quite frankly, is anyone in your community. Sometimes there are people from the faith community. They are doctors, educators, anyone whose life has been affected by mental illness. NAMI is primarily a volunteer organization, and so people from throughout the community have joined us to improve the lives of others who are affected by mental illness. So what is mental illness, or what is a mental health diagnosis? It's not just hereditary. Mental illness can be triggered by biological, psychological, and social factors. We most commonly hear of mental health diagnoses like anxiety, depression, autism, eating disorders, bipolar disorders, and some other. For adults, we might hear referred to PTSD, schizophrenia, and so on. Some of the early warning signs of mental illness is excessive worrying or fear, feeling extreme highs and lows, engaging in more risky behavior, maybe engaging in substance use, maybe driving erratically. Many of those things can be factors that initially show signs of mental illness, but not always. So why should we talk about mental illness? Because over 60 million Americans are affected by mental illness each year. That's 1 in 5 adults, 1 in 10 young people. So mental illness affects quite a large population, and it is something that we're uncomfortable talking about. And the more we talk about it, the more people will seek the help that they need. Why are we having this conversation with you? because you are the change that we need. Quite frankly, you will hear me talk throughout this presentation about stigma. What we've learned over the years is actually us adults perpetuate the stigma of mental illness more than you young people. We found that young people are really comfortable talking about whether or not they've been bullied, whether or not they're in treatment, whether or not they take medication, and quite frankly are proud of the progress that they make in taking care of their mental health. What's really important here is that you understand that 50% of all lifetime cases of mental illness onsets by the age of 14, 75% by the age of 24. So it's really important to us that you be comfortable talking about your mental health, talking to your friends about mental health, and recognizing the signs and symptoms in case someone you know is affected by mental illness. You'll have a better idea of how to help them. 37% of high school students and college students ages 14 to 21 will be diagnosed with a mental illness and potentially drop out of school. 17% of the U.S. youth has been affected by mental illness in a given year. 20% experience anxiety. 74% of students tell us that they've been stressed to the point that they cannot carry out their normal daily function. And it's important to understand that depression, while very common, is the leading cause of suicide and the leading disability worldwide. Many young people who live with mental health disorders end up being classified as bad kids. And what happens? That means 70% of young people in our juvenile justice system has at least one mental illness. 20% has a serious mental illness. 37% of our jail population are persons who live with a mental health diagnosis. And yet only 43% of people who live with a mental health diagnosis will seek or receive treatment in a given year. What does that mean? That means over 50% of the people who have a mental illness go without services. Now, what's really important is we understand why people don't seek treatment. The largest barrier is stigma. And stigma is a mark of shame. It's a mark of disgrace. It's when our friends make us feel that we're weak because we live with a diagnosis. 75% of the people who live with a mental health diagnosis tells us that they feel that they've been the victim of stigma. We have to change the way we look at mental illness in this country and in this culture so people will seek the help that they need. Stigma, like mental illness, affects everyone, but stigma does vary by community and culture. For example, I mentioned earlier that about 43% of the US population that lives with a mental health diagnosis will receive treatment. If you're a member of a minority community like African American or Hispanic, you can cut that number to almost half. And it's because the stigma in the communities are different. And this is some of the reasons that people in minority communities don't seek mental health help. We have less access to treatment. We're less likely to have access to insurance. We have a poor quality of care, and the levels of stigma is just higher. One of the things that's come out this year with COVID and the pursuit of social justice is racism has now been identified as a public health crisis. While there's much we need to do to address racism in this country, we can't forget the importance of mental health care. The effects of racism and racial trauma in mental health is real and it cannot be ignored. The disparities in access to mental health care in the communities of color cannot be ignored. The inequality and lack of cultural competence in mental health treatment cannot be ignored. And I want to stress this, while cultural competency is important, It's not the only factor. And I'm speaking specifically to people in the minority communities because though we like to receive treatment for someone who looks like us, it's not always necessary. At the end of the day, what's really important is that we get the care that we need. COVID-19 has disproportionately affected the African American community as well. While the African American community only makes up 14% of the population, we represent over 30% of the COVID cases and over 40% of the deaths. And again, that has to do with stigma and access to care. Interestingly, there are many other factors where mental illness, in fact, impacts our culture. 20% of our homeless community lives with mental illness. 46% of people who live with what we call dual diagnosis, which means they have a mental health diagnosis and maybe a substance use diagnosis, is in our community. Many people who have substance use problems have underlying mental health issues, and they end up doing what we call self-medicating. The other really interesting statistic here is that corporate America needs to become more involved in this conversation. In the United States alone, we lose over $193 billion in lost earnings per year, specifically attributed to mental illness. Not substance use, not suicide, mental illness. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for young people between the ages of 10 and 34. That's significant. 17% of U.S. high school students have told us they've seriously considered suicide in the last year. While we talk about homicide a lot, the fact of the matter is over 2.5 times the number of people die in the United States by suicide than by homicide. But when we turn on our evening news every day, the first story we hear about is homicide. Again, we have to change the way we look at and address mental illness in this country because suicide is in fact preventable. More teenagers and young adults die by suicide than from cancer, birth defects, AIDS, heart disease, lung disease, pneumonia, stroke, or influenza combined each year. That's how big this problem is. And the fact is, because we're so uncomfortable talking about mental health and suicide prevention, most of us don't know what to do when faced with a loved one or friend who might be considering suicide. So a few tips are, when a suicide-related crisis occurs with friends, family, we're often caught off guard. We're simply not prepared. We don't know the warning signs. One of the things we need to do is talk openly and honestly. Don't be afraid to ask questions like, do you have a plan for how you want to kill yourself? It's really important that we ask that question directly, though I understand it's uncomfortable. And the reason is, if you ask directly, most people will give you an honest answer. If you ask in a passive-aggressive manner, like, well, Kevin, you're not thinking of hurting yourself, you are less likely to get an honest answer from me. If you ask a friend or family member and they say yes, and you've heard them make other references like, I don't want to be a burden anymore, the world would be better off without me. Those are signals that that person is seriously considering taking their life. And you want to respond calmly, you do not want to debate it with them, and you want to stay with them and say, can I take you to get help? Don't say, I think you should go talk to someone. And you want to treat it just as if that person experienced a physical injury in front of you. If your friend slipped off the curb and broke their ankle, you wouldn't say, Kevin, you should go get help. You say, Kevin, let me help you, go get help. And that's the same way we want to react when someone is experiencing suicidal ideation. If there are multiple people around, you want to have only one person speak at a time. Don't debate, and be calm and express concern for the individual. You want to make sure you remove any access to weapons that they can use to harm themselves, whether it's guns, knives, etc. Don't argue, don't threaten, don't debate. And I understand you're going to be nervous, but try not to fidget and just be patient and listen, because most people who are considering suicide don't want to die. They need to be heard, and you can be that voice and that friend. While there are a lot of really significant and negative statistics here, one of the things that I really want you to walk away with is understanding that there is hope. Millions of people who receive mental health treatment go on to live very productive, normal lives. Many celebrities, many of the brightest people who've ever walked the face of this earth, whether it's Einstein or Beyonce, who've lived with mental health conditions, have gone on to live very normal, productive lives. What's critical is, like any other medical diagnosis, we get early diagnosis and early treatment, which leads to better outcomes. There are many ways you can support NAMI, and as I mentioned early on, NAMI is a nonprofit, volunteer-run organization. So we host many events that allow us to raise awareness, but also raise funds to support our local affiliates. This coming Saturday, October 10th, will be the NAMI Walks National Day of Hope virtual walk. And you can participate simply by doing something in your community, whether it's walking in your community, whether it's getting together with family and baking your favorite dish, or like me, I'll be watching a college football marathon. But anything that you can do to support the initiative to raise awareness and funds to support NAMI would be very much appreciated. This last slide shows a number of resources that I hope you will keep with you and make use of if you ever have need. Thank you.
That concludes our first session of today, but the action continues right now. If you'll notice right above this video, there is a link to join our live Q&A with Kevin Fisher, where you can get some of your questions answered. We can also take a deeper dive into some of the proactive programming that Kevin has seen work in schools across the state. So I will see you in that link very soon.